Today we're going to be talking about the Great Awakening, and now we're getting to the point in the course where we're going to be considering the American Revolution. And today's lecture is about religion again. It's about a religious movement called the Great Awakening. But it's also about the social consequences of the Great Awakening, which I think are profound. And I'll give away the ending at the beginning and say that I think the American Revolution really isn't possible without the Great Awakening. That the Great Awakening prepares the ground for the American Revolution. And I think it does that by undermining authority and make people begin to question received opinion. So that's where we're headed, and this is how we're going to get there. We're going to talk about how the Great Awakening starts out as a revival. And really, this is the invention of revivalism. This is something we still live with in the United States. Revivalistic religion's very, very much alive. Millions of people believe in it. And the origins of revivalism really is the Great Awakening, at least the origin in the United States. And the origin in England is about the same time. So we're going to talk about first a revival in Northampton, Massachusetts. And then we're going to talk about revivalism in Georgia. And much of the lecture is going to revolve around one person, and that's George Whitefield. George Whitefield was English. He wasn't American, but he spent a lot of time in America. He made 7 tours to America. And he is the person that, more than any other individual, introduces this type of revivalistic preaching into America. And by revivalistic preaching, I mean that he appeals to emotion. I mean that he speaks simply. I mean that he tells stories. It's a big departure from the type of preaching that they've been listening to previously. So we're going to talk about Whitefield and reactions to Whitefield, including Benjamin Franklin's. And then finally, we're going to talk about the unintended consequences of the awakening, because nobody, including Whitefield, expects the awakening to take the directions that it does. He's just thinking that he's trying to help people save their souls and go to heaven, but it reorders society in some profound ways. So we're going to look at that, how it undermines authority, and finally, what the implications are for the American Revolution. Terms today, Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was, other than Benjamin Franklin, the leading 18th century intellectual in the United States. A very, very intelligent guy, but also very much a Puritan. He's almost an exact contemporary of Franklin's, and you can see, I think, in the differences between Franklin and Edwards, it tells us a lot about what life was like in the 1700s. George Whitefield, I've already mentioned. Whitefield is religiously closer to Edwards than Franklin, and he's actually the link between those two men. I don't believe they ever met, but they both knew Whitefield, and he's in some ways inhabits a middle ground between them. The Great Awakening, I've just defined, it's this religious revival or a series of religious revivals beginning in the 1740s that profoundly changed the religious landscape in America. New lights are a product of the Great Awakening. After the Great Awakening in New England, and these are terms that only apply to New England, the old lights and the new lights sort of split the church. The new lights are the people who are very profoundly influenced by George Whitefield and by the Awakening and want to take religion in a new direction. They see by new lights. And the old lights are the people who say, look, what we had before was great, and this new fad that's come along is just a fad. And denominationalism is a fancy word for just talking about different denominations, different branches of Protestant Christianity. That's something that's been true of Protestantism from the start, really from the beginning of the Reformation. As soon as somebody disagreed with Martin Luther, you've got denominationalism. But it's a particularly strong phenomenon in America. Many, many denominations, and a lot of that is the result of the Great Awakening. Today's themes. The most important unintended consequences of the religious revival known as the Great Awakening were social, and that's true. There's really only one intended consequence, and that's to get people closer to God and, going to heaven. But the reordering of society that comes about, or maybe that's too grandiose, the social consequences that come about were all unintended, and they're very important. And then second, the awakening's attack on authority was a precursor to the revolution. And I'll say more about that as we go on. All right, so we're going to start out in 1736 in Northampton, Massachusetts. Northampton, Massachusetts is a place we've talked about already, not that town specifically, but that area. It's on the Connecticut River in northern Massachusetts, relatively close to the Vermont border. And it's one of these places that was the western edge of New England in the 1670s, and it's attacked in the King Philip's War, and it's a dangerous place to be during the French and Indian War, and it's still rather frontier conditions, although frontier conditions are just ending really when Jonathan Edwards shows up there. And here's Edwards. Now, I told you Edwards was probably the second most important American intellectual, after, maybe third, after Franklin and Jefferson. I don't know, maybe you want to talk about the Adamses that way too. But anyway, Edwards was a very important American intellectual. He's the first American-born philosopher, and he was philosophically interested in joining philosophy and Calvinism. He's very much a Calvinist. He was the son and grandson of ministers. He was went to Yale to be a minister, and you can see him there in his ministerial garb. His professional career was spent as a preacher. So Edwards is somebody who's very religious, very much a Calvinist, really the kind of the last generation of the old school Puritans in a way, and also a very philosophically minded man. He was the first president of Princeton University, getting a little ahead of our story telling you that. Edwards went to Yale at 14, and then he stuck around for the equivalent of a master's degree at Yale, and then he moved to Northampton to work for his grandfather, who was the minister in Northampton. Edwards stayed in Northampton as his grandfather's assistant until his grandfather's death, and then he took over the pulpit in Northampton. And if you've ever read anything by Jonathan Edwards, people used to be assigned this in high school sometimes. It's a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where he talks about all the horrible tortures of hell, and he says that your soul's like a spider being roasted over a fire, and he talks about the spider shriveling up and everything. It's kind of unfair, I think, to Edwards. That's the only thing ever seems to be read by him anymore. Edwards had a very sweet disposition. He was crazy about his wife. He liked nature. A very sincere man. Anyway, he is the minister in Northampton after his grandfather's death, when in 1736 he begins to find something odd is happening. People suddenly seem to be more interested in religion, and they take it very seriously. And many of them are starting to have these conversion experiences where they think that, they've got the assurance that they're elect, that they've been saved, and they're filled with joy, they're filled with the love of God, they're filled with what they perceive to be as grace. And Edwards is overjoyed. He talks about how, what a surprise this is, and it seemed to come out of nowhere. And on the other hand, there are also people who fall into the depths of despair because, all around them, all these people are saying, oh yes, I found God, and God has, come into my soul, and so forth and so on. And the other poor folks are like, well, why hasn't this happened to me? And there's at least one suicide in Northampton by someone who despairs of ever attaining grace or going to heaven. So there's this intense period of religious belief and conviction and emotion, and it sweeps across Northampton, and Edwards writes about it. And in 1737, he publishes this book, A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God. And and it's about what we would now call a revival. There's no word for it at that point. It's about this isolated town and the American frontier and northern Massachusetts, western Massachusetts, and that's that. But the book gets read. It gets read in England, and it gets read by some very influential guys. So let's get to that now. George Whitefield is one of these influential guys. George Whitefield is a student of even more famous and important religious figure in English and American religious history, and that is John Wesley. John Wesley, W-S-L-E-Y, was a professor at Oxford while Whitefield was a student. And Wesley is a very charismatic guy, a very, very pious man, and Wesley starts a group, or develops a group of followers, or coalesces around him, called the Holy Club. And the Holy Club first starts out as a prayer group, but they become profoundly influenced by Wesley. Wesley believes that preaching is too doctrinal, it's too dry, it's too cerebral. He thinks that when he reads his Bible, he reads Jesus preaching in simple terms, telling stories, teaching simple lessons. And Wesley believes that's what Christian preaching needs to return to. And he's very, very influential. And he spends his entire life as a priest of the Church of England, but when he dies, his followers break away from the Church of England. They say the Church of England is hopeless, that Wesley tried forever to change it, and it isn't going to change. And they start a new religious denomination called Methodism. Okay, so that's a little ahead of our story. That hasn't happened yet. But in 1737, sorry, 1736, John Wesley comes to Savannah, Georgia. And he spends a year there with his brother, Charles. And Charles, by the way, wrote a lot of hymns that are still sung. If you go into a church and grab a hymnal, and just look up Charles Wesley in the index, and you'll see that he's written a number of songs that are still around, including one famous Christmas carol, and I always get it wrong, but there's a Christmas carol by Charles Wesley too. Anyway, Savannah, Georgia, where they come in 1736, has just been founded. Here it is in 1734. Savannah is carved out of the wilderness. Georgia's the last of the American colonies founded, and it's founded for the same reason Australia was later, as a penal colony. They take all the criminals and debtors out of London and kick them out and send them off to Georgia to get rid of them. So it's a raw new settlement. You can see here it's just under construction with a tiny handful of houses in 1734. It's a miserably hot and humid climate by English standards, I think by my standards too. It's full of people who are, outcasts. And so Wesley sees that as a place to go and save souls. Here are the miserable, here are the sinners, and they need someone to come preach to them. So he comes in 1736 with his brother and fails. They don't succeed in really changing things in Georgia, and they go back to England. However, in 1738, their student, or John's student, George Whitefield, comes back to Savannah to start again. And Whitefield, unlike Wesley, has an enormous success. Wesley, by the way, had read Edward's Faithful Narrative while he was in Georgia and was deeply moved by it. So Wesley inspires his student George Whitefield, and Whitefield decides to replace Wesley in Georgia and arrives in 1738. And then some very interesting things begin to happen. There's another view of Savannah at about the same time. And here's George Whitefield preaching. George Whitefield, as it turns out, was a very, very dynamic preacher. He's a young guy in 1738. He's only 24 years old. He was good looking, at least people considered that at the time, considered him to be at the time, and he had a beautiful voice. Everybody remarks on his voice. So Whitefield is a very dynamic and attractive figure. And he decides that he's going to preach in Georgia the way he learned to preach in England, this kind of dynamic, emotional style that does away with this old style I've talked about before of a sermon like a legal document or a legal argument, all footnoted and very closely argued and full of quotations and all of that sort of thing. He throws that aside. He speaks extemporaneously, no notes, nothing, and he tells stories, and he talks about heaven and hell, and he talks about God's love for the individual, and he makes it personal. And this is a radical departure from what people are used to. They're used to a style of religion that's stuffy and formal and repressed in terms of emotion and proper. Whitefield's none of those things. He is something new and dynamic, and he blows people away. Well, the powers that be in Georgia, the established ministers in Georgia, don't like it. They don't like his popularity. They don't like his style. They think of it as kind of cheap, fly-by-night theatrics. They don't like him. Some jealousy, I'm sure. And they begin to forbid him to speak in their churches. But these churches are tiny. They're little places. So that, in a sense, they do Whitefield a favor, because he begins to speak outdoors and begins to draw bigger and bigger crowds as he does so. Outdoor preaching is something that the Methodists had innovated in England, and Whitefield applies that in Georgia, and he has enormous successes. Well, then Whitefield looks around for a cause. And just like I talked about the Chesapeake some lectures ago, with all these widows and especially orphans running around, Whitefield sees that there are many orphans in Georgia. And he decides to start an orphanage. And he decides to raise money for his orphanage. And he sets about doing that. Here he is later in life as a very famous preacher. Here's a slide of him preaching outside in Britain, but this is what he does in America. And he ends his speeches, his sermons, I should say, with an appeal for money for the orphans. And he's extremely successful. Well, he goes back to England, but he comes back the next year in 1739, and in 1739 he decides to take his show on the road, and he travels up and down the East Coast. And he's giving a message that is very much one that we're familiar with today. He talks about the need for a new birth. You have to be born again to truly know God. He also talks about how anybody willing to open their hearts to God wants to save you all. There's none of this Calvin stuff about limited atonement and how it's very difficult to get into heaven and you're never sure. Whitefield says if you open your heart to God, if you ask God to come to you, you will be answered. Jesus says in the Bible, ask and thou shalt receive, seek and you shall find, knock and the door shall be opened. And that's what Whitefield says too. If you look for God, God will respond to you. So it's a much more appealing message. And he talks about being born again, and it's very famous. So in 1739, Whitefield goes to Philadelphia, and I want to talk about that a little bit more. There he is preaching the open air again, and you can see here, by the way, the emotional response people have to him. There's a man weeping in the foreground. There's a lady kind of crouched down, either it's crouching or sitting on something, or maybe even on her knees with her hands across her heart. There's the drunk on the far right making fun of the whole thing. But look at all the other people, how seriously they're taking this, how pious they are. That lady in the lower left corner is reading her Bible. That's what Whitefield's effect is. Now here he is in England, and there are 50, 60 people around him, but in America he becomes a phenomenon, and he draws enormous crowds. So let's talk about him in Philadelphia. Here's a map of Philadelphia between the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers, and downtown Philadelphia is on the Delaware side. This is Philadelphia as it's first laid out in even blocks, and the ones on the right that are dark, they're the ones that are settled, and whenever this slide was made. And then right in the center, you can see this is an open square, and that's the market. That's Market Square in Philadelphia, the central square. Here's another very early map, 1683. We can see the central square and a couple other parks or public gardens or whatever. And that's the city that Benjamin Franklin knows, and it's the city that Whitefield comes to. Let's go to one more slide here. I'll get back to the quotation. This is what it looks like in the 18th century. We can see all the docks on the Delaware River on the right. You can see Market Street that goes to that central square in the center where the market is. And in the middle of Market Street, there's this edifice, and that's what we're talking about here. So let us turn to Benjamin Franklin, because Benjamin Franklin knew George Whitefield, and he got to know anybody interesting who came to Philadelphia, and Whitefield's no exception. So Franklin goes to see Whitefield, and he's got a very interesting response, and this is in Franklin's autobiography. He says, talks about how Whitefield had come from Georgia. The settlement of that province had lately been begun, but instead of being made with hardy, industrious husbandmen, that is farmers, accustomed to labor, the only people fit for such an enterprise, it was with families of broken shopkeepers and other insolvent debtors, many of indolent and idle habits, taken out of the jails, who, being set down in the woods, unqualified for clearing land and unable to endure the hardships of a new settlement, perished in numbers, leaving many helpless children unprovided for. The sight of their miserable situation inspired the benevolent heart of Mr. Whitefield with the idea of building an orphan house there, in which they might be supported and educated. Coming northward, he preached up this charity and made large collections, for his eloquence had a wonderful power over the hearts and purses of his hearers, of which I myself was an instance. So Franklin goes to hear Whitefield. And then he tells this wonderful self-deprecating story that I certainly identify with, about how he goes to hear Whitefield, and he knows it's for good cause and everything, but he's a cheapskate. He doesn't really want to part with his hard-earned money. I happened to attend one of his sermons, in the course of which I perceived he intended to finish with a collection. So, Franklin's radar's up now. And I silently resolved that he should get nothing from me. I had in my pocket a handful of copper, 3 or 4 silver dollars, and 5 pistoles in gold. So copper, silver, gold is worth more in that order. This still is. As he proceeded, I began to soften and concluded to give the coppers. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that and determined me to give the silver. And he finished so admirably that I emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all. So Franklin, despite his cheap intentions, winds up donating everything in his pocket to Whitefield. A great story, I think. Now let's get to the slide here. The quotation in the last slide is what I'm about to read to you. He had a loud and clear voice and articulated his words and sentences so perfectly that he might be heard and understood a great distance, especially as his auditories, his listeners, however numerous, observed the most exact silence. So Whitefield was able to mesmerize people so much that they listen to him in complete silence. Okay, now look carefully at the map here. He preached one evening from the top of the courthouse steps, which are in the middle of Market Street. That's that black spot there in the middle of Market Street, 2 blocks up from the river. And on the west side of 2nd Street, which crosses it at right angles. So Whitefield is right at the intersection of 2nd Street, first one behind Front Street, which is on the river, and Market Street, right to the center right of our slide here. Both streets were filled with his hearers to a considerable distance. Being among the hindmost in Market Street, I had the curiosity to learn how far he could be heard, by retiring backwards down the street towards the river. And I found his voice distinct till I came near Front Street. Franklin's almost at the river at that point, when some noise in that street obscured it. Imagining then a semicircle of which my distance should be the radius, and that it were filled with listeners, to each of whom I allowed 2 square feet, I computed he might well be heard by more than 30,000. This reconciled me to the newspaper accounts of his having preached to 25,000 people in the fields, and to the ancient histories of generals haranguing whole armies, which I had sometimes doubted. That's, again, a wonderful story that tells us so much about Franklin and really life in the 18th century. On the one hand, we have this revivalistic preaching, and people are mesmerized by it, and they're worrying about heaven and hell, and there's, many of them, as we've seen, are maybe kneeling or crying or reading their Bible along with Whitefield, praying, thinking about the future, their future after they die. Immensely emotional. Whitefield was famous for making people, cry and then making them filled with joy. He had crowds in the palm of his hand. So all of that's going on around Franklin, and Franklin's response is to think, I wonder how many people are here. And he runs a little experiment and does a little mathematical calculation, and then comes to a conclusion about how many people mathematically can hear one speaker at one moment. So Franklin's completely unaffected by the religion going on around him. Instead, he's concerned with this kind of social phenomena of how many people can one person speak to and still be heard. Very, very interesting response.